The heat in Richmond that August of 1852 was a living thing. It was a presence that pressed down on the slate roofs and brick sidewalks, drawing a shimmering haze from the cobblestones and a rank, sweet smell from the magnolia blossoms that drooped, defeated, in the manicured gardens of Church Hill. The air was thick enough to drink, a soupy concoction of humidity off the James River, coal smoke from the Tredegar ironworks, and the cloying perfume of drying tobacco from the warehouses down in Shockoe Bottom. It was an atmosphere of elegant decay, of wealth built on a foundation of human misery, and it seeped through the window panes and under the doors of the grand Fairchild residence on Grace Street. Inside, the air was different, only in its stillness. It was heavy with the scent of beeswax and lemon oil, the faint, phantom aroma of last night's roasted mutton, and the whisper of dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that sliced through the heavy crimson drapes of the dining room. This was Henry's world. Not the whole house, of course. His world was a series of prescribed paths through its grandeur, from the sweltering detached kitchen to the pantry, from the pantry to this dining room, and then back again. He was a ghost in the machine of the house, his presence required, but his personhood erased. He was 18 years old, and he had been owned by Master Alistair Fairchild for 6 of them. He had been Henry of Richmond for as long as he could remember being anything, the name of the city that held him captive grafted onto his own, a permanent brand of place and possession. He stood now beside the mahogany sideboard, motionless, a silver coffee pot held in a steady, gloved hand. The gleam of the silver was so perfect, it reflected a distorted version of his face. High cheekbones, a broad nose, eyes that had learned to be deep, still pools, revealing nothing of the currents that churned beneath. He focused on the reflection, a fractured man in a polished surface, and listened. The house was a symphony of sounds, and he was its most attentive audience. The ponderous tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, each swing of the brass pendulum a second of his life, shaved away. The drowsy buzz of a bluebottle fly, battering itself against a window pane, a frantic, tiny prisoner. And the primary instrument in this morning's concert, the delicate, rhythmic tapping of Mistress Isabel Fairchild's fingernail against her porcelain teacup. May. Tap. 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 It was a sound like a tiny, insistent hammer, a sound that could drill its way through a man's skull. Isabel Fairchild sat at the head of the long, gleaming table, a vision in pale, blue silk. The morning light caught the gold threads in her auburn hair, piled high in a complex architecture of curls and pins. She was beautiful in the way a hothouse flower is beautiful, delicate, cultivated, and utterly dependent on a controlled, artificial environment. Her cruelty was of a similar nature. It was not the raw, roaring brutality of a field overseer's whip. It was a quieter, more refined violence. It was in the twist of her lips, when his cuff was not perfectly starched, the sigh of theatrical despair, when a fork was misaligned by a fraction of an inch, the way her voice, soft as brushed velvet, could strip a man of his name, his thoughts, his very soul, leaving only a function, an object. "Henry?" she said, her voice never rising above a conversational murmur. The tapping stopped. The fly ceased its buzzing. Even the clock in the hall seemed to hold its breath. "Yes, mistress." His own voice was a low, careful thing, sanded smooth of any inflection. It was a voice designed to be heard but not noticed. "The cream. It is forming a skin." She did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the small, offending silver pitcher in the center of the table. To her, the film on the cream was not a simple product of heat and time. It was a moral failing, a sign of sloth, an unraveling of the perfect, ordered world she constructed around herself each day. It was his failing. "My apologies, mistress." He moved without a sound. His feet, clad in soft shoes, knew the precise spots on the floorboards that did not creak. He lifted the pitcher, his dark fingers, a stark contrast against the cool, bright silver. He was a shadow moving through her light. He took it to the sideboard, skimmed the offending skin with a spoon, and returned it to its exact, predetermined spot on the lace doily. She did not acknowledge him. Her attention had already moved on. She unfolded the asterisk Richmond Enquirer, the crisp paper crinkling in the silence. She scanned the columns, her perfectly shaped brow furrowed slightly. The news was full of the usual anxieties: abolitionist agitators in the North, the precarious price of cotton, a runaway slave apprehended near Fredericksburg, his punishment described in calm, clinical detail. These were the tectonic plates of their world, grinding against each other far beneath the polished surface of her breakfast table. Henry returned to his post, his body a statue of servitude. But his mind was a fugitive. It fled the suffocating room, fled the oppressive heat, fled the sound of Isabel's breathing. It flew back 2 weeks, to a moment of casual, devastating cruelty. He had been polishing the master's boots in the small utility room off the kitchen. In his pocket was his only true possession, a small, crudely carved mockingbird, whittled from a piece of scrap pine by his father, a man he barely remembered. A man sold down the river to the cane fields of Louisiana when Henry was 5. The bird was no bigger than his thumb, its details worn smooth by years of anxious rubbing. It was his connection to a life before this one, a silent testament that he had come from somewhere, from someone. Isabel had swept into the room, her silks rustling, on a hunt for some misplaced tin of silver polish. She saw him with the bird in his hand. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, narrowed. She did not ask what it was. She did not need to. Her world was divided into 2 categories: things that belonged to her and things that did not exist. "What is that filth, Henry?" she had asked, her voice laced with a disgust usually reserved for vermin. He had tried to close his hand, a foolish, reflexive gesture of protection. "Nothing, mistress, a piece of wood." "Let me see." It was not a request. He opened his palm. The little bird lay there, exposed and vulnerable. Before he could process her intent, she had plucked it from his hand, walked to the slop bucket, and dropped it in among the greasy water and vegetable peelings. "We do not have time for idle idolatry and sentiment in this house," she said, her tone as crisp as fresh linen. "Your hands are for work." She had then turned and swept out, the incident already forgotten, a piece of dust flicked from her perfect life. Henry had stood there for a long moment, the air punched from his lungs. He had later retrieved the bird, wiping it clean, but it was not the same. It smelled of rot and refuse. It had been profaned. It was no longer a link to his past. It was a reminder of his utter powerlessness. The small act had been a declaration. Not even his memory was his own. Everything, down to the contents of his heart, was subject to her whim, her disposal. That was the moment the quiet currents in the deep pool of his eyes had begun to churn with a new, dangerous energy. The resentment, a low, chronic fever he had lived with for years, had begun to spike. He started to notice things with a new, terrifying clarity. He noticed the way Master Fairchild, a man of booming pronouncements about liberty and states, writes in his parlor, never looked the people he owned in the eye. He saw them as he saw his horses or his hounds, valuable livestock to be fed, managed, and used. He noticed the way Isabel's smile, the one she offered to her guests, never, ever reached her eyes. It was a mask of civility, worn over a core of cold, hard control. And he noticed the mockingbird that lived in the great magnolia tree outside the dining room window. It was a brilliant mimic. It could sing the song of the robin, the trill of the sparrow, the mournful cry of the dove. It had a vast repertoire of stolen melodies, arias of other birds, lives. But Henry knew it had no song of its own. It was a hollow thing, a collection of echoes. He felt a kinship with it. He, too, had no song of his own. He spoke the words the Fairchilds expected, wore the expression they required, moved in the ways they dictated. He was a mimic of a man. The thought began to fester. What would happen if a mockingbird, tired of echoes, decided to scream its own raw, artless, terrible note? Moved in the ways. Moved in the ways. Moved in the ways. Moved in the ways. Tap. Moved in the ways. A de dream time. The sound brought him back to the present. Isabel had put down the paper. She was stirring her tea now, the silver spoon clinking against the porcelain with a delicate chime. The sound grated on his nerves, each chime a tiny spark on a trail of gunpowder. "The toast is cold," she said, her voice flat. She poked at a slice with her fork. "And it has been cut unevenly. Look at this corner. It is an affront." Henry looked. The corner of the toasted bread was, perhaps, a millimeter shorter than the others. It was an imperfection so slight that only a mind dedicated to finding fault could have perceived it. He felt a wave of heat rise up his neck, a heat that had nothing to do with the sweltering August morning. It was the heat of pure, undiluted rage. It was the culmination of the drowned bird, the thousand small humiliations, the years of being an invisible machine. "I will fetch a fresh plate, mistress," he said, his voice a low tremor. "Do not bother," she sighed, pushing the plate away with an air of profound martyrdom. "My appetite is ruined. It seems that simple competence is too much to ask for this morning." She picked up her teacup. Her little finger extended in that way she had, a gesture of supreme and effortless gentility. She brought it to her lips. In that moment, something inside Henry snapped. It was not a loud, dramatic break, but a quiet, seismic shift. The world seemed to slow down, the sounds of the room fading into a dull, distant roar. The ticking of the clock, the buzzing of the fly, the distant clatter from the kitchen. It all receded. All he could see was the curve of her white neck, exposed and vulnerable between her elaborate hairstyle and the collar of her silk dress. All he could hear was the mockingbird outside the window, launching into a frantic, chaotic medley of stolen songs, a discordant, meaningless jumble of sound. He moved. It was not a decision, but an impulse, a deep, primal command, from a part of himself he had kept locked away for his entire life. His hand went not to the coffee pot he was still holding, but to the sideboard behind him. His fingers, trained to handle delicate silver and crystal, closed around the handle of the long, sharp knife used for carving the Sunday roast. Its wooden handle was smooth and familiar in his palm. He took 2 silent steps forward. She had not noticed. She was still sipping her tea, her eyes closed in a moment of private dissatisfaction. The light from the window illuminated the fine, pale hairs on her nape. He could see the faint blue tracery of a vein just beneath the translucent skin. The house held its breath. The fly on the window pane was suddenly still. The mockingbird in the magnolia tree fell silent. The only sound was the final, resonant tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, marking the end of 1 second and the beginning of an eternity. He saw it all with a preternatural clarity, as if viewing a tableau under glass. The pristine white of the tablecloth, a canvas waiting for a new color. The deep, blood red of the strawberry jam in a small crystal bowl. A premonition. The glint of sunlight on the polished silver knife he now held at his side. He saw his own reflection again, not distorted in the coffee pot, but clear and sharp in the blade of the knife. A face he barely recognized, its placid mask stripped away, leaving only a terrible, focused calm. He was standing directly behind her chair. He could smell her lavender water, a scent he had always associated with dread and submission. Now, it was just a smell. He raised the knife. The movement was fluid, economical, a gesture practiced 1,000 times in the dark theater of his mind. He was no longer Henry, the houseboy. He was an instrument of a justice so raw and absolute it had no name, no law, no precedent. He was the mockingbird, finally singing its own song. It was a single shrieking note of pure, unadulterated release. Isabel Fairchild's eyes opened, not in alarm, but in mild annoyance. She had perhaps sensed a presence, a shadow falling over her. She began to turn her head, her lips forming a question, a reprimand. The name Henry was half formed on her tongue. It was the last sound she ever made. The blade was sharper than he had imagined. It made a sound, a soft, wet tearing, like ripping a piece of thick, damp silk. It was not a dramatic slash, but a swift, precise pull across the offered curve of her throat. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The world remained frozen in its tableau. Isabel's eyes were wide with a surprise that had not yet had time to become terror. Her hand, holding the teacup, was still poised halfway to the saucer. Then the color came. A blossoming line of impossible crimson appeared on the white column of her neck. It was a painter's stroke, vivid and stark. The teacup slipped from her fingers. It did not shatter. It fell onto the thick Persian rug with a soft, muffled thud, spilling a small brown pool onto the intricate patterns. But then the line on her neck widened, opened like a second, grotesque mouth, and the blood followed. It did not gush or spray as he might have imagined. It poured, a silent, thick, horrifyingly abundant cascade of deep, dark red. It streamed down the front of her pale blue silk dress, staining it a bruised purple. It pooled in her lap, and then began to drip, a steady, heavy patter onto the floor. Plip, plip, plip. The sound was obscene in the morning stillness. She made a noise, a choked, gurgling sound from the ruin of her throat, like a blocked drain trying to clear itself. Her body gave a single, violent convulsion, a puppet whose strings had been abruptly cut. Her head fell forward, and she was still. The only movement was the continuing, relentless flow of blood. Henry stood over her, the knife still in his hand. It was dripping. A single drop of her life fell onto his black shoe, a tiny, perfect ruby. He looked at what he had done, but he felt nothing. Not horror, not triumph, not even fear. He felt only a vast, hollow emptiness. A silence where the rage had been. The pressure that had been building inside him for years had been released, and there was nothing left. He looked around the room. The sunlight still streamed through the windows. The dust motes still danced. The fly on the window pane began to buzz again, a frantic, mindless sound. The grandfather clock in the hall began its slow, ponderous ticking once more. The world, which had stopped for that one eternal second, had started up again, but it was a different world now. The old rules had been incinerated. From the kitchen, he heard Delia, the cook, begin to hum a spiritual, her voice a low, mournful rumble. It was a song of endurance, of waiting for Jubilee. He knew that in a few moments she would send the scullery maid, Martha, to clear the breakfast dishes. Time was running out. He moved with the same preternatural calm. He walked back to the sideboard, placing the bloody knife next to a bowl of polished apples. The contrast was beautiful and obscene, the domestic and the profane, side by side. He looked at his hands. His gloves were clean. He was a meticulous servant. He stripped them off, laying them neatly on the polished wood. Then he turned and walked out of the dining room, his soft shoes making no sound on the heart pine floors. He did not run. He walked with a steady, unhurried gait, a man who had already passed through the gates of hell and had nothing left to fear. He walked through the grand foyer past the portraits of Fairchild ancestors who stared down at him with flinty, possessive eyes. He opened the massive front door, its brass handle cool beneath his fingers. He stepped out onto the porch, into the thick, oppressive heat of the Richmond morning. The air no longer felt suffocating. It felt thin, sharp, electric. He could taste it on his tongue, the flavor of iron and ozone, the taste of a storm about to break. He walked down the marble steps and onto the brick sidewalk of Grace Street. A carriage rattled by, the driver tipping his hat to the grand house, unaware of the tableau of crimson and silk within. A woman across the street was sweeping her porch. She glanced at him, a flicker of surprise at seeing a house servant exit through the front door, but then she dismissed him, turning back to her chore. He was invisible again, but in a new way. He was not a functionary. He was a phantom. He did not look back. There was nothing behind him but a room that would forever smell of lavender and blood. He did not know where he was going. North, perhaps. To the great, dismal swamp. To the river. It did not matter. He was no longer Henry of the Fairchild House, Henry of Richmond. He had severed that connection with a single, fluid motion. He had cut his own name free from their ownership. As he reached the corner of the street, turning toward the warren of alleys and lanes that led down to the river, he heard it one last time. From the top of the magnolia tree in the Fairchild's garden, the mockingbird began to sing again. It was not a stolen melody this time. It was a series of harsh, frantic, grating squawks, a sound of pure alarm. It was the bird's own voice, its true voice, and it was ugly and raw and absolutely free. Henry listened for a moment, a faint ghost of a smile touching his lips. Then he melted into the shadows of the city, leaving behind only a great, spreading silence and a single, indelible stain of red on a white linen tablecloth. The discovery was made by Martha, the young scullery maid, not 10 minutes later. Her scream was a thing of primal, animal terror. It sliced through the morning quiet, a sound that could curdle milk and stop hearts. It brought Delia running from the kitchen, her large hands white with flour. It brought the stable hand, Samuel, from the carriage house. It eventually brought Master Alistair Fairchild down from his study, his face a mask of irritation at the disruption, an expression that dissolved into a slack-jawed, ashen horror as he stepped into the dining room. The room was a slaughterhouse, but a strangely serene one. The body of his wife was slumped in her chair, a grotesque parody of sleep. The blood was everywhere, a shocking, vibrant artist's palette of red. It had soaked into the priceless rug, spattered the legs of the table, and dripped in a slow, steady rhythm from the seat of the chair, forming a dark, viscous pool on the polished floor. The smell was already beginning to rise, a coppery, metallic tang that mingled with the scent of coffee and toast. It was the smell of the abattoir brought into the temple of domestic order. Alistair Fairchild did not scream. He made a low, guttural sound, the noise of a man who has witnessed the absolute collapse of his world. His universe, built on the bedrock of control, of predictable routines and the unquestioning submission of others, had been shattered. It was not just his wife who was dead, it was the entire edifice of his life. The city of Richmond reacted with a collective spasm of fear and fury. The murder of a white woman, a lady of society in her own home, during the civilized ritual of breakfast, was not merely a crime. It was an insurrection. It was the ultimate nightmare of the slave-holding South made manifest. The trusted servant, the familiar shadow in the house, turning into an angel of vengeance. The story spread like wildfire, carried on the tongues of horrified matrons, grim-faced businessmen, and terrified servants. The Richmond Enquirer, which Isabel had been reading that morning, would run a lurid account the next day, transforming Henry from an invisible boy into a monstrous fiend, a brute with the face of a man and the heart of a serpent. Immediately, the city's mechanisms of control, usually humming beneath the surface, roared to life. The slave patrols were called out, their ranks swelled by volunteers, ordinary citizens with fear in their eyes and rifles in their hands. They swept through the city, kicking in the doors of cabins in the servant quarters, storming the taverns and workshops of the free black community, dragging men out for questioning. The city was placed under a virtual lockdown. Every black face was now a mask for a potential killer, every shadow a hiding place for a rebel. The tenuous peace of master and slave, a peace maintained by the constant, implicit threat of violence, was broken. Now the violence was explicit. In the Fairchild kitchen, the atmosphere was thick with a silent, suffocating terror. Delia, the cook, was interrogated for hours by the city watch. She was a large, stoic woman whose face was a roadmap of a hard life. She had seen countless acts of cruelty and had learned that survival lay in silence and studied ignorance. She told them what she knew, which was nothing. Henry was quiet, she said. He did his work. He never caused trouble. She offered them the mask of the contented slave, the only face it was safe to show. Inside her heart was a cold, hard knot. She had seen the change in Henry after the incident with the carved bird. She had seen the light in his eyes dim and then harden into something she did not recognize. She had said nothing, prayed for him, but she knew that a spirit, once pushed too far, either breaks or snaps back with terrible force. Henry had snapped back. Samuel, the stable hand, was questioned even more brutally. He was young and strong, with a fire in his eyes that the patrollers mistook for insolence. They beat him, trying to force a confession of conspiracy from his lips. But Samuel, like Delia, knew nothing of Henry's plan. He had often spoken with Henry in the quiet of the stables, hushed conversations about freedom, about the North, about the rebellions of Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey. Henry had always been a listener, absorbing Samuel's fiery words with a quiet intensity. Samuel had thought him timid, perhaps even broken. He had been wrong. As the blows fell, Samuel felt not just pain, but a surge of awe and terror. Henry had done it. He had actually done what they all dreamed of in their darkest, most secret hearts. He had brought the war into the master's house. The manhunt for Henry became the focus of the entire state of Virginia. Bloodhounds were brought in, massive, slobbering beasts with mournful eyes, bred for the purpose of hunting men. They were taken to the Fairchild house, where they cast about, whining, catching the scent from the discarded gloves on the sideboard. They picked up a trail, a faint trace of Henry's passage through the city's alleys, down towards the shipyards and lumber mills that lined the banks of the James River. The trail led them to the edge of the water, a place of mud and sawdust, and the rank smell of the river. It was a chaotic landscape of stacked timber, rusting machinery, and the shacks of poor white and free black laborers. Here, the dogs grew confused. The sense of 1,000 people, of tar and fish and industry, overwhelmed Henry's trail. They cast back and forth along the riverbank, howling in frustration, but the scent was gone. It was as if Henry had simply dissolved into the muddy, brown water of the James. Days turned into weeks. The initial furor in Richmond subsided, replaced by a gnawing, low-grade fear. Security was tightened. New, harsher rules were imposed on the city's enslaved and free black populations. The Fairchild house on Gray Street was shuttered, its windows dark and empty. Alistair Fairchild, a broken man, had taken his other children and moved to his country estate, abandoning the site of his horror. The house became a landmark of fear, a place children hurried past, a place where whispered ghost stories were born. They said that on quiet nights, you could still hear a woman screaming, or see a bloody handprint appear on the window panes. And Henry? Henry became a legend. He was a ghost, a specter that haunted the slave-owning society of Richmond. He was everywhere, and nowhere. There were sightings of him in a dozen places at once. A farmer in Hanover County swore he saw a wild-eyed man, matching Henry's description, living in the woods, surviving on stolen chickens and roots. A ship's captain reported a stowaway who jumped overboard in the Chesapeake Bay when the vessel was searched. Abolitionist papers in the North printed sensationalized, anonymous accounts of a brave slave who had struck a blow against tyranny and made his way to freedom in Canada. For the white population, he became a boogeyman, the personification of their deepest fears. His name was used to frighten disobedient children. The story of what he did was a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of the savage beast that lurked beneath the placid surface of their domestic servants. The bloody breakfast on Gray Street became a touchstone of horror, but for the enslaved people of Richmond and beyond, Henry became something else entirely. His story was told not in the parlors, but in the hush of the cabins at night, in the fields under the blistering sun, in the stables amidst the smell of hay and leather. In these tellings, he was not a monster. He was a hero, a phantom of vengeance. He was the man who had refused to be invisible any longer. The details of his story were embellished, mythologized. The carving knife became a great silver sword. The mistress became a wicked sorceress who tortured her slaves. His escape was not a desperate flight, but a miraculous disappearance. They said he could walk on water, that he could turn himself into a bird and fly away. The mockingbird became his symbol. When they heard its frantic, discordant cry, they would look at each other, a secret understanding passing between them. "It was Henry," they would say. "Henry is still out there." Henry's journey, in reality, was one of terror and desperation. He had reached the riverbank that morning, his heart hammering against his ribs, the calm of the initial act replaced by a flood of adrenaline. He knew the patrols and the dogs would be after him. He saw a skiff tied loosely to a pier belonging to a fisherman who was mending his nets. Without a second thought, he untied it, pushed off into the current, and let the powerful James River carry him away from the city. He drifted downstream for miles, hiding under a piece of old canvas whenever he saw another boat or signs of life on the shore. The sun beat down on him, and the river, his potential salvation, was also a vast, exposed space. By nightfall, he was miles south of Richmond. He abandoned the skiff and plunged into the wilderness that bordered the river, a dense, primeval landscape of cypress swamps and pine barrens. This was the beginning of his true ordeal. The swamp became his sanctuary and his prison. The air was thick with mosquitoes that rose in whining clouds at dusk. The water was stagnant and black, teeming with cottonmouths and snapping turtles. He learned to move at night, navigating by the stars he could glimpse through the thick canopy of trees. He learned to eat things he would have once found repulsive: grubs, raw fish he caught with his bare hands, the bitter roots of plants Delia had once pointed out as having medicinal properties. He was hunted, not just by men, but by the landscape itself. He was stalked by hunger, by fever, by the terror of being utterly alone. There were times, delirious with infection from a gash on his leg, that he would see Isabel Fairchild's face in the gnarled bark of a cypress tree, her eyes wide with surprise, the crimson line blossoming on her neck. He would hear the tap-tap-tapping of her fingernail on porcelain, a sound that echoed in the drip of water from a hanging vine. He was haunted by the ghost he had created. But he was also driven by something more powerful than fear, the memory of the carved mockingbird. He had lost the physical object in his flight, but he carried its meaning with him. It was a reminder of what had been taken from him, and what he had, in one terrible, irrevocable act, taken back. He was no longer an echo. His own song might be a scream of pain and rage, but it was his. The thought gave him a strength he did not know he possessed. He traveled for weeks, moving south and east, following the whispers of a secret geography, the network of runaways and sympathizers known as the Underground Railroad. He found help in unexpected places. A free black boatman who smuggled him across a river, hidden under a pile of fishing nets. A Quaker family who hid him in their barn for a week, feeding him and tending to his infected leg, their faces full of a piety that was both comforting and unnerving. They saw him as a soul to be saved, a brand plucked from the burning, but they could not meet his eyes for long. They could not comprehend the act that had set him free. To them, he was a victim. They could not see the killer that he knew himself to be. From Virginia, he made his way through the Carolinas, then into the treacherous swamps of Georgia, always moving, always a ghost. He learned to read the signs of the natural world, to blend into the shadows, to become a creature of the forest. The soft-spoken houseboy from Richmond died in that swamp, and a new man was born, a man as hard and resilient as the cypress roots that anchored the trees in the black water. The trail of historical record on Henry vanishes at the banks of the James River. He steps out of the light of documented history and into the shadows of folklore. There is no record of his capture, no poster advertising his execution. He simply disappears. Perhaps he was caught by a patrol in some forgotten corner of the wilderness, his body left for the vultures. Perhaps he drowned trying to cross a flooded river, his bones sinking into the mud. Perhaps he was bitten by a snake, his life ending in a feverish, lonely agony in the depths of a swamp. Or perhaps he made it. Perhaps he reached the relative safety of Spanish Florida, or was smuggled onto a ship bound for the Caribbean, or even made the impossibly long journey north to Canada. Perhaps he lived out his days as a free man, under a new name, in a new place, the memory of the bloody breakfast room on Grace Street, a secret he carried to his grave. Perhaps he even found a way to sing a new song, one not of rage or mimicry, but of a life he had forged for himself out of the fire of his own past. His fate remains a mystery, an open question, an ambiguity that is, perhaps, the most fitting end to his story. He escaped the prison of the Fairchild House, and in doing so he escaped the prison of a knowable history, becoming pure, untamable legend. Epilogue *. The year is 1870. The Civil War has come and gone, tearing through Richmond, leaving a landscape of ashes and ghosts. The Fairchilds' grand house on Grace Street still stands, though it is scarred. A fire during the evacuation of the city licked at its western wing, leaving the brick blackened and charred. For years after the war it sat empty, a monument to a fallen world, its windows like vacant eyes. Now, a new family lives there. A northern carpetbagger, a man who made his fortune in railroads and speculation, has bought it for a song, eager to own a piece of the vanquished aristocracy. He has had the house restored, the floors polished, the walls repainted. But some stains, he discovers, cannot be removed. The dark, irregular blotch on the Persian rug in the dining room remains, a permanent shadow no amount of scrubbing can erase. And the servants his wife hires, newly freed men and women trying to build a life out of the rubble of slavery, will not stay in the house for long. They speak of a cold spot in the dining room, of the scent of lavender on the air when no flowers are present, of a faint, rhythmic tapping sound that can be heard late at night. One evening, an old man comes to the back door of the kitchen. He is Samuel, the former stable hand of the Fairchilds. He is bent and weathered now, his youth burned away by the war and the hard years of Reconstruction, but his eyes are still clear. He has heard that the new owner is looking for a reliable groundskeeper. The new lady of the house, a brisk, practical woman from Boston, interviews him in the kitchen. She asks him if he knows the history of the house. "Yes, ma'am," Samuel says, his voice a low rasp. "I know it. They say it's haunted," she says, a dismissive wave of her hand. Nonsense, of course. Superstition. Samuel just looks at her. He does not tell her that the house is indeed haunted, but not by the ghost of Isabel Fairchild. The house is haunted by a memory. It is haunted by the oppressive silence that preceded the scream, by the system of quiet, daily violence that made the final, bloody act not an aberration, but an inevitability. He gets the job. He finds a strange, sad comfort in tending the grounds of the old house. He spends his days trimming the hedges, weeding the flower beds, and caring for the great, ancient magnolia tree that still dominates the garden. One hot August afternoon, almost 2 decades to the day since the murder, he is resting in the shade of the magnolia tree. The air is thick and heavy, just as it was then, full of the same smells of heat and decay and life. A mockingbird lands on a branch above his head. It opens its beak and lets out a string of perfect, liquid notes. The call of a cardinal, the whistle of a quail, the sad song of a mourning dove. It is a beautiful, flawless performance of stolen songs. Samuel listens, his eyes closed. He thinks of Henry. Over the years, he has heard all the stories. Henry the monster, Henry the ghost, Henry the hero. He doesn't know which is true. He doesn't know if Henry died in a swamp or lived to be an old man in the cold, clean air of Canada. But as he sits there, under the shade of the tree, he thinks he understands something. The world talks of freedom now. They have Jubilee and the vote and the promise of a new life. But the old songs, the songs of mastery and submission, still linger in the air. People are still mimicking the ways of the past, singing the tunes they were taught. What Henry did was a terrible thing. It was an act of horror, born of horror. It was the answer of the abattoir to the subtle violence of the drawing room. But it was his. It was the one, true, original note he ever uttered. A scream is not a song, but it is a sound of one's own making. It is a declaration of presence, a violent refusal to be silent or to sing another's melody. The mockingbird finishes its concert and flies away, leaving a profound silence in its wake. Samuel opens his eyes and looks at the grand house, its windows reflecting the blood-red light of the setting sun. He does not know what became of Henry of Richmond, but he knows that the question of Henry's fate is less important than the question his life, and his one terrible act, still asks. It is a question that hangs in the hot, humid air of the New South, a question that whispers from the dark stain on the dining room floor. What song do you sing when your own has been stolen? And what sound do you make when the silence becomes more than you can bear?